just do show of hands and we'll bring a mic over to you. I don't know.
Are your parents, like, when your parents first found out you guys had disabilities, how did they react?
So how did your parents react when they first found out that you got disabilities? If you remember that, I don't know if everybody even remembers that moment. I know Andrew, you kind of talked a little bit about that, but how did you guys know how your parents reacted to you having a disability?
With me, when my parents reacted to it, it was really hard. But I mean, I do speak 2 languages, so my mom understood that I had a learning disability, just because English wasn't my first language. But in high school and middle school, she was at every IEP meeting, always asking every question. She was just crazy all the time. So I mean, whose parents aren't crazy? But that's just how my mom was.
Okay. Anybody else or going?
My parents were, I actually didn't find out from my parents. I found out from a speech therapist. But once I finally heard it from them, they were so supportive. And my dad was at every IEP meeting, always made sure they were giving me the best of everything that I needed.
All right. Awesome. Okay, so anybody else? Any other questions? Okay, a few hands. I don't know.
I guess what is the biggest transition or the biggest barrier that you had to jump or come across going from high school to whether it's going to Brazil or going to college or wherever you guys are at some point? What is the biggest transition that you had to deal with or barrier that you had to break in order for you to feel comfortable again?
That big barrier. Go ahead.
So but before I went to Brazil, I was scared. I was I'm going so far away from my family and some of my friends, and I'm going to a whole other country that no one knows my name and almost nobody speaks the language over there. And my exchange year was really good. I enjoyed it so much, but the beginning of it was really rough because I didn't know anyone over there, and I lived with host families that were approved by Rotary, which is the organization that I did this program with. And this exchange year actually, I feel like it made me a stronger person, an even stronger person, and it's made me more excited for life because it proved that there's many great moments out there in life, depending on what you do.
So I just want to follow up that. So prior to this, eye-opening experience, traveling overseas, and now you're, pursuing this career that's related to that experience. So what were you feeling like you were going to do before this happened?
Before what?
Before you went away and went to what was it, Brazil?
Brazil, yes.
Yeah. What did you think you were going to do? Did you have a career goal?
Well, I always wanted to be a chef for my whole life because I enjoyed cooking. But when I got to Brazil, I changed my mind to become a flight attendant because I love to travel. And I'm actually bilingual in Portuguese and Spanish. And for those people who speak more than one language, people, they would want to be hired as a flight attendant. And I enjoyed so much translating to people who doesn't speak Portuguese but speak English and doesn't speak English but speaks Portuguese. So I enjoyed translating so much.
I just want to highlight something here that I think is an important takeaway. It's the value of exposure and experience, right? It's part of the reason why we do the college tour as part of this summit. We just finished taking everybody out here around the college, visiting different parts of it. When you expand your experiences, when you're able to see different careers, I'm assuming you saw some flight attendants and you were like, oh, I could do that, right?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely, right? So imagine if you never got on that plane, right? So the more exposure we get, I think it helps us to face those barriers, right? So anybody else, is there one barrier that you had to face in making that transition from high school to where you are now?
I think for me, when I first moved to Reno, the hardest part was cooking, not gonna lie. But that was one of them, but it was moving away from my parents. That was like the hardest part, because I didn't know anybody here, and it was really hard for me to do that.
So we giggle, but life skills are important, right?
Kind of sucks, but.
Yeah. Yes, it does kind of suck, right? But yeah, but like, you gotta know how to wash your underwear, you gotta know how to feed yourself, right? Like, we all have this stuff that we just like have to do when we make those steps into the adult world. Managing our bank accounts, paying our bills on time, right? And the more exposure, and this is a message to, of course, the adults in the room, but also young people. If you know you're leaning too heavily on your parents, start stepping up, right? Start doing some of these things for yourself. Okay. Anybody else?
Yeah, I can. So the biggest barrier I think I had to face was I had to come to the conclusion that going to college and getting a job was my biggest thing. But how this was facing a big barrier is because going to school and having a job is a lot of work, and it's a lot of stress on yourself. You constantly have to make sure your stuff's turned in on time. You have to make sure you make it to your job on time, you show up. And also within that, another a big barrier I faced too is I purchased my very first car. I'm very proud of it. I actually pay the car, I pay the monthly payment, I pay the insurance on it, I pay for all the maintenance on it, and I also pay my cell phone bill because my parents said, it's time for you to grow up, you can do this. And that was that's where the big self-advocating came into, was to be able to pay those type of bills. And to be able to face a barrier like that was very challenging, but now it's just a piece of cake to make those payments on time, go to school, and go to my job.
Wow. Okay, we have time for a couple more. Why don't we look at this side of the room? Got a hand up over here. Next question.
Does your IEP accommodations transfer over? Are they the exact same as college do?
All right, so do the IEPs come over, and do the accommodations come over? Are they exactly the same as when you were in high school and now that you're in college?
Some of the accommodations do, like extra time on tests, a note taker. Those are two that I kept for my IEP. However, retaking tests is something that does not transfer over. You are not allowed to retake tests in college.
I guess for me, the only one that I actually got was getting extra time on my test, and that was pretty much it, and being in a room all by myself.
I can tell you in the advocacy world too, when I and I guess just about anybody who wants to access disability services in college, we have to bring a whole bunch of paperwork, right? So it's those old IEPs, it's any testing documentation that was put together. There's actually legislation being pushed through now in DC, which has got bipartisan support that, if you've got a history, right, a record from your school that says you've had a disability, you were on an IEP, you were getting disability supports, I shouldn't have to provide all this extra information to prove to someone now, right? So it's not that way currently, so you better have your documentation together, but it is something that people are fighting for just to make college more accessible for many of us, right? Because what if you don't have, if you have a hard time kind of getting that information together, but I was on an IEP since I was in the 3rd grade. My LD's not going away. I'm gonna be 90 years old and still listening to audiobooks, right? So to be able to prove that over and over again to get access to a greater education, people are starting to realize it's a little overboard. But another thing is, and just to put a fine point on it, the IEP itself, you will not have an IEP in college. Special ed stops when you go to college. There's still disability supports, you still get accommodations, but it's like a whole different law and everything else. And that's why it's so important. You got to go down to that disability support office we had everybody go to as part of the tour. Take your old IEPs, take your old documentations, and then they'll see what accommodations you can get now that you're in college. And I think, for many of you, you're going to get a lot of the same sort of supports. Another thing I would just kind of guard against is modifications. So there are no modifications in college, right? So they're not going to make your test shorter. They're not going to do anything like that. They will give you accommodations, right? So instead of a printed test, they may do it in an audio format or something along those lines. But, and particularly for those of you who are saying, you're interested in going to college, if you're getting modified tests, the closer you get to graduation, you need to do as little of that as possible as practice, right? As practice for when you finally make that jump to college, if that's your goal. All right, we'll do one or two more questions. Anybody else? Okay, hand up in the back. Oh, okay, go ahead.
How hard?
It's on. We got you. Go ahead.
How hard was it to make a new set of friends?
Well, that's a good one. How hard was it to make a new set of friends? I guess from high school to college. Amber, I think you said you still got the same circle though, right? The same crew.
Yeah, kinda.
Okay, all right. I'll back off. Okay. Okay, so how hard was it? That was the question. How hard was it to make a new circle of friends?
For me, I'll basically talk to anyone I can set my eyes on, so it really wasn't that hard for me to make new friends. Lucky for me, a lot of my friends that I had in high school transferred over to the current college I'm at, so I did get to keep a lot of those friends, and then I made new ones as well, which was awesome.
No? Okay, all right. Very good, very good. Anybody else? Any other questions? I'll do one or two more, and then we'll bring this to an end.
So, with your IEP and stuff, did you ever have like a really hard thought of college with your being into your senior year of high school?
So, like, were you kind of afraid of college, like making that jump?
More of like during the applicating time, applying for college and stuff. What were your thoughts and stuff like that? Like, were you thinking that you weren't going to get accepted into a college just because you have an IEP, or because of your disability and it affected your grades during high school?
Do you think when you were applying to college, did you think that having a disability, being on an IEP when you were in high school, did you think they were going to maybe look at you a little different? What were some of the thoughts going through your mind as you were going through the application process?
I guess for me, it was really hard because I didn't think I was going to get into UNR, and it's kind of a hard question. But yeah, I didn't think that I was gonna, I was at the top of my class, but when I was going through the application and they asked me for all the paperwork, it did go through my mind that I wasn't gonna get accepted, but then I looked at the acceptance rate and it was pretty good, so.
Anybody else? No? Okay, and I'll say this, and maybe one way to kind of phrase that is were you afraid of being discriminated against for being a person with a disability, right? And, I think it's something that a lot of us kind of struggle with when it comes to self-disclosure of any kind. Is someone going to treat you differently, right? Or if you disclose on a job, right? Or as part of that application, are they going to maybe not hire you or whatever? So that form of discrimination is actually illegal, right? But worse than it happening out in the world to us is when we do it in our own minds. I don't want anybody in this room to limit their dreams because of fear, right? I would rather you take the chance, right? And then see what happens, right? But to not even apply because you're afraid that you're going to be rejected, right? Or to hide who you are. Now, this is the other reality. We're all self-advocates. We have to feel out every situation, right? There are some of us who are going to be like, yo, now is not the time to disclose, depending on what the situation is, or maybe I disclose a little bit later. But realize that the law has your back, right? And I think that's actually very reassuring to me. And then I love the idea that you were like, well, look at the stats. They let a lot of people in. They missed, come on, give me a shot, right? Okay. And again, I think some of this is how kind of bad we make it in our own minds versus what the reality is. I can also tell you that in the world of work, there's a new law, new requirements coming in that companies, and a lot of our big companies that do work with the federal government, they have a requirement now to hire more people with disabilities. So if you're putting in applications and if they ask, do you have a disability or not, some of that is about making sure that, if you need any support, you can have it, but also it's because they want us, right? They want to be able to have us as part of their employment roles, right? So you actually, yeah, absolutely. So it may actually be in your favor to check the box, right? Okay. We're at time, all right? So I want to stop here. But before we all step off the stage, I really enjoyed this panel. Was this panel any good? What do you think? So guys, so thank you so much for being here. And again, it's great. I love facilitating panels. I love doing it because we get to hear from multiple perspectives. Also, these folks are role models, right? They're role models. They're out here, they're doing it, right? And they're fighting the fight, and they're being honest with you about what some of the challenges are that they're facing. And so, it's great when folks who are like national speakers, we come up here, we do our thing. But it's also really great when there's local people that you can see that are like in that next step phase. All right, so just join me in thanking our panel one more time. Thank you.